going to explain the worst situation in fiscal operations of Sri Lankan government. Worst situation, Narakama Tattva, fiscal operations, Rajya Mulya Kriyakarakam. That means the activities related to the government expenditure, government revenue, and financing the budget deficit. Government expenditure, Rajya Viyadama, government revenue, Rajya Adayama, and financing the budget deficits. Ayavaya hingaya moolyana kirima, piyawa ganima. Right, first of all, let's start with the overall budget deficit. Samasta ayavaya hingaya. Overall, samasta. How do you calculate it? Here, I am giving you the figures as a percentage of GDP. It is very difficult to deal with the absolute values, rupee values, because they are trillions, billions. Very difficult to identify them. So, central bank follows this technique to quickly evaluate. ඒක විශ්ලේෂණය කරන්න. නැත්නම් පරීක්ෂාවට ලක් කරන්න. Evaluate. Right? So, yeah, what do you mean by as a percentage of GDP? If the GDP is 100, total revenue of the government is 9.2, which is a very low amount. සෑහෙන ප්‍රමාණයක් මේක. And you can see this government total revenue has decreased from 2019 to 2020. Has decreased. අඩු වෙලා. What is the major reason? Actually, the Gotabaya Rajapaksa government decreased the VAT rate. That's one reason. The other reason, because of the import controls, import restrictions, revenue from excise duties, Banda Seva Badu, Saha import duties, Anayana Badu, Unilabina Adayana Aduima. That is the major reason. Total expenditure has also decreased, but you will see it is also not a good sign. Ekat honda lakshanayak neveyi, not a good sign. Right? This total expenditure consists of recurrent expenditure, capital expenditure, and net lending. This recurrent expenditure has increased. Recurrent expenditure means punaravartana viyadama. Navata athivana viyadama. It has increased. This is the expenditure which is incurred by the government to maintain the day-to-day activities of the government, which has the nature of reoccurrence. Navata athivime swabhavaye tiyenne meke. Right? It's the expenditure incurred by the government. Rajya visin darana viyadama. For what? To maintain the day-to-day activities of the government. Etinida katayutu karagena yamata. It has increased. Capital expenditure, basically the public investment, right? It has decreased. That means the government has cut off public investment. Rajya Ayojane kapa karala tiyenne. It is not a good sign. Right? That means the infrastructure facilities of the country will collapse. Right? Yatitala pahasukam sapayima sampurnama kada වැටෙනවා. Which affects the economic growth of the country. රටේ ආර්ථික වර්ධනයට මේක දැඩිව බලපානවා. Affect බලපානවා. Right? Net lending means lending minus repayments for the government, corporations and institutions. That figure is zero. It doesn't have a considerable value. Right? So this is the reason why this total expenditure has decreased. Recurrent expenditure has increased while the public investment has decreased. Right? So anyway, while the total expenditure has decreased, budget deficit has widened. අයවැය හිඟය පුළුල් වෙලා. තව අයවැය හිඟය තව වැඩි වෙලා. This budget deficit, yes, that means the government has to borrow more. Government රජයට තව ණය ගන්න සිද්ධ වෙනවා. Which causes debt accumulation. Right? ඒක debt accumulation. ණය තොගය එකතු වීමට හේතුවක් වෙනවා. Right? So that is the severe situation where we will have further higher and higher debt stock then. Our debt liability will increase. අපේ ණය වගකීම තව වැඩි වෙනවා when there's a overall budget deficit. Right. Let's analyze it further. Then current account deficit, which is calculated total revenue minus recurrent expenditure only. Current account, right? Varthana ginuma. Only the recurrent expenditure. Punaravartana vedana. That means the expenditure which occurs again and again within the given period to maintain the government day-to-day activities, right? That also has a huge deficit, considerable deficit, and the deficit has widened, right? Deficit has ever widened, right? Because total revenue, as I said earlier, is not sufficient, and you can see this deficit is very close to total revenue as well. That means the government has to borrow. Government has to borrow. රජයට සිදු වෙනවා ණයට ගන්න. For what? Even to maintain the day-to-day expenses of the government. එදිනෙදා වැඩ කරගෙන යාමට රජයට ණය ගන්න සිදු වෙනවා. Which causes a severe budget deficit as we saw earlier. අපි අර කලින් දැක්ක පරිදි. Then this recurrent expenditure consists of interest payments for the government debt stock. Interest payments, which has increased, and it is the largest one. Interest payment for the debt stock is the largest one. Lokuma item එක interest payment. Then salaries and wages to government servants. It has increased too. Current transfers, right? That is pension, samurdhi, fertilizer subsidy, porasana adare. Right? They all have increased. As a result, recurrent expenditure has increased. Right? That is the reason why there is a severe current account deficit. This current account deficit represents government dis-savings. රජයේ ඍණ ඉතුරු නැහැ. Right? For the public investment, there is no money. There is no money for public investment. රාජ්‍ය ආයෝජනයට මුදල් නැහැ. Which affects the economic growth of a country. Right? As I said earlier. Then the worst situation can be observed with this primary account balance. Primary account balance එකෙන් තමයි පේන්නේ නරකම තත්ත්වය. Worst situation. Right? Because this primary account balance is calculated without deducting interest payment. Without deducting interest payment. That means if there is a deficit in primary account, there is a deficit in primary account, that means there is no money even to pay interest for the debt stock. Right? Mudal, there is no money, mudal nahe. Even to pay interest, government interest payments. Interest payments given nawa, mudal nahe. To pay interest, the government has to borrow. ණයට ගන්න සිද්ධ වෙනවා. Just imagine if it happens to your household. Just imagine if it happens to your household. ඔබේ නිවසට ඒක උනොත් මොකද කරන්නේ? Right? You have to borrow to pay interest for your debts. Actually, you will have to commit suicide soon. Commit suicide. සියදිවි විහානි කරගන්න සිද්ධ මොකද there is no solution. So that is exactly what is happening to your country, our country. Right? We do not, the government does not have sufficient funds to repay the interest, to pay interest. Then the government has to borrow even to pay interest for the debt stock, which will cause further accumulation of debts. Debts ණය තව accumulate වෙනවා. වැඩි වෙලා යනවා. Even yesterday, Sri Lanka Central Bank increased the margin for letter of credit. Central bank increased it up to 100%. That means the importers have to pay full money to import goods and services. What is the purpose? To restrict that, right? Because Sri Lanka is running out of dollars. Right? This export revenue has to be used even for the import, essential imports, especially oil and the garment materials, right? So while yes, that export revenue is for all these things, right? But the unfortunate thing is that export revenue is never sufficient to repay the foreign debt amount, right? Okay. The other one is debt service payment is also beyond the total revenue, right? Debt service obligation for the year, that means interest payments and amortization payments, which is 13 point. It has decreased, but it is, I told you the reason for that, right? This is 13.0, while the government revenue is 9.1. So government revenue is not sufficient to pay interest and amortization payment of the given year. As a result, you can see debt service payment as a percentage of total revenue is above 100%. That means it's gone beyond that value, right? Which causes further debt accumulation. So when you analyze all these statistics, you can come to a conclusion. There is a perilous situation in the fiscal operation of Sri Lanka, and the debt accumulation and the debt service payment, right? Which will cause further debt crisis in the country. In my next video, I expect to talk about the possible measures government can take to avoid this worst crisis. Thank you very much for watching my video. Please subscribe my YouTube channel and even share these videos with your friends. Thank you.